Professor Corwin, please.
A little bit later this morning, I'm going to be showing you, toward the end of my presentation, some segments from a very amazing documentary called The Trouble with Evan. And because of that, I had to use my notebook computer, which has the bookmarks on it for moving from the different segments. So I apologize for the change in the computer. It's where I come from and my contact information. If anyone is interested in these PowerPoints, you can email me or the Harov Institute and we'll make them available to you. There's my disclosures. How many of you can read English? Could you raise your hands if you can read English? And if you can't, raise your hands if you don't read English. Okay, that's excellent. My apologies for not knowing Hebrew, but I was never taught it. Here are the objectives for this presentation: to just familiarize you, to tell you a little bit about the consensus that are developing around defining emotional, psychological child abuse, and then to illustrate its occurrence and some of the challenges and impacts of psychological child abuse with a couple of case examples. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who helped me with this presentation. Julie Bradshaw, who's the hospital's director of our Center for Safe and Healthy Families, who contributed PowerPoint slides. Sue Bennett, who is a pediatrician and child psychoanalyst in Canada, who also contributed some of the PowerPoints. Paul Parker, who's a prosecutor in Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City, Utah, who had me testify in a case, which I'll be sharing some of the facts with you, and he provided some of the pictures and PowerPoints. I'd like to thank Stuart Hart and Marla Brassard for their pioneering work in the defining and creating guidelines for the evaluation and the study of psychological maltreatment. And they did an extraordinary thing with the support of John Myers, who's the editor of the APSAC, American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children's Handbook on Child Maltreatment. They have provided a draft of their revised chapter on psychological maltreatment that will probably not be published for another year in the latest revision of the textbook. And it's available to the participants in this conference on a restricted basis, and you can receive a copy if you're especially interested in psychological maltreatment by contacting the Harov Institute. That's on the authority of the David from the Schusterman Foundation. Sorry to surprise the others here from the Institute. And then finally, John Sterling, who also contributed some slides. The field addressing psychological maltreatment had a significant meeting in 1983, the International Conference on Psychological Abuse of the Child, and they agreed upon this definition of psychological maltreatment: that psychological maltreatment of children and youth consists of acts of omission and commission which are judged on the basis of a combination of community standards and professional expertise to be psychologically damaging. Such acts are committed by individuals singly or collectively, who by their characteristics, age, status, knowledge, and organizational form are in a position of differential power that renders a child vulnerable. Such acts damage immediately or ultimately the behavioral, cognitive, affective, or physical functioning of the child. Examples of psychological maltreatment include acts of rejecting, terrorizing, isolating, exploiting, and missocializing. So that was the first consensus statement. And there were a couple of professors from Israel who presented at this meeting. In the late 80s, under the authority of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children and its Professional Guidelines Committee, which at that time I chaired, Stuart Hart, Marla Broussard, and others worked for several years on developing guidelines for the evaluation of suspected psychological maltreatment. And this definition is the definition that was published in those guidelines and has really stood the test of time in terms of the field and being adopted and cited by other articles and studies on psychological maltreatment. That psychological maltreatment, which they prefer over emotional, because psychological is broad enough to cover both the cognitive and behavioral impacts. A repeated pattern or extreme incidents of caregiver behavior that convey the message that a child is worthless, flawed, unloved, unwanted, endangered, or only valuable in meeting someone else's needs. I think that's a much simpler, more straightforward definition. The degree of psychological maltreatment is what determines the ultimate long-term harm to children in those cases where the abuse is not fatal or does not cause permanent neurological damage. So that is why psychological abuse is really the lowest common denominator and that which is the most frequent form. And then what follows here are the different types of categories of psychological abuse. Spurning, which includes belittling, degrading, and other non-physical forms of overly hostile or rejecting treatment. You'll see many of these things illustrated in the segments of this video, which I will show you after I introduce the topic. Shaming and or ridiculing the child for showing normal emotions such as affection, grief, or sorrow. Consistently singling out one child to criticize and punish to perform most of the chores or to receive fewer rewards. Public humiliation. Next category of terrorizing. Placing a child in unpredictable or chaotic circumstances. Placing a child in recognizably dangerous situations. In the state of Utah, which is where I come from and where I practice, there was an appellate court case which affirmed the conviction of a man who had dangled a child over a second-story railing as a way of terror or scaring the child as a punishment. And that was affirmed after a criminal prosecution, and that conviction held. Setting rigid or unrealistic expectations with threat of loss, harm, or danger if they are not met. Threatening or perpetrating violence against the child. Threatening or perpetrating violence against the child's loved ones or objects. And exposure to intimate partner violence or domestic violence is and has been shown in many studies to be harmful to children. In only a few of the states in the United States is it also considered child abuse, but Utah is one of those states. And the conflicts between the domestic violence advocates and the child abuse advocates have been resolved because in Utah it is a form of child abuse. It's called domestic violence related child abuse. And the same agency that takes care of suspected child abuse, our Department of Children and Family Services, Division of Children and Family Services, also takes care of domestic violence with or without children present. And by having it within the same agency, they have learned how to work together on the complexities of the relationship between domestic violence and child abuse. Exploiting and corrupting is another form. Modeling or permitting or encouraging antisocial behavior, developmentally inappropriate behavior. This is the kind of abuse in Charles Dickens' story, Oliver Twist, and teaching the children to beg or to steal. Encouraging or coercing abandonment of developmentally appropriate autonomy through extreme over-involvement, intrusiveness, or dominance. Restricting or interfering with cognitive development. Denying emotional responsiveness, ignoring. And of course, this is very common in neglect situations. Being detached and uninvolved through either incapacity or lack of motivation. Interacting only when absolutely necessary. Failing to express affection, caring, and love for the child. And isolating. Confining the child or placing unreasonable limitations on the child's freedom of movement within his or her environment. And the case example that Paul Parker shared with me some of the slides and that I testified in a criminal trial in Utah is one of isolation, among other things. Placing unreasonable limitations or restrictions on the social interactions with peers or adults in the community. Mental health, medical, and educational neglect. So those are the categories of psychological maltreatment. If there are scientists or researchers here in Israel who are interested in partnering and collaborating with Marla Broussard and Stuart Hart, they have developed a questionnaire to give to children and youth to help establish the prevalence of these kinds of experiences. And Stuart invited me to extend that invitation to potential collaborators. So how common is psychological maltreatment? Among official reports, it is one of the smallest categories. But if we, and this is data from 2003, these are official reports from the different state agencies to the federal government in the United States. A little under 1 million children reported, substantiated as abuse victims. You see only 5% as emotional maltreatment. But think about this. That's 60% of neglect. Many of them would meet the criteria for psychological maltreatment as well. And certainly physically abused and sexually abused are psychologically maltreated. And it is the psychological, it's the meaning of the experience that creates the long-term harm and that can benefit from psychotherapy to address that harm. There are here's a couple of other ways of trying to look at more recent data from NCANS, that's official reports, that's the National Child Abuse data, again about in the 6-7% range of substantiated cases. But in 1991, Vissing, Strauss, Gellis, and Xarope asked over 3,000 parents about their use of verbal or symbolic aggression with their children. And over 60% reported one or more instances in the previous year. Over 25% reported 10 or more instances, and over 10% reported 25 or more instances. And another way to look at the prevalence, not the incidence, and Dick made a very important distinction, Dr. Krugman, in his presentation about the difference between incidence data and prevalence over an entire childhood and adolescence. But if you do what has been done with sexual abuse and you ask adults, did you have the following experiences when you were growing up? And that's where that data from the Los Angeles Times survey, the representative sample of the United States, with 26% of the females and 16% of the males having experienced some form of sexual abuse during childhood or adolescence. That kind of methodology has been used for psychological maltreatment, and it's around a third of adults report experiences that could fit under that definition of psychological maltreatment. So this is a big problem. Sue Bennett provided this slide, and she made the point that I've been making repeatedly. Psychological maltreatment is embedded in all other forms of child abuse and neglect. That in Canada, 14% of their reported cases in 2003 were emotional maltreatment, but 26% of their cases had exposure to domestic violence. In Utah, because we categorize that as a crime of child abuse, we know how frequent it is. It is the most common form of child abuse, more common than neglect in Utah. 26% of our substantiated child abuse cases are domestic violence related child abuse. And so ultimately, we don't really know how common psychological maltreatment is because it's so difficult to discern with accuracy this very prevalent but most hidden of all child maltreatment. So what are some of the risk factors? There's factors related to the children, the parents, family, community, and social factors. What are some of those? Children who are disabled. We know disabled children are at a higher risk of all forms of abuse. Unwanted or unplanned pregnancies. There are some gender effects related to psychological maltreatment. Young age, single parent status, poor parenting skills, history of maltreatment in the parent's childhood, substance abuse, physical or mental illness, spousal violence. Family risk factors include poor socioeconomic status, highly correlated with neglect, overcrowded living conditions, social isolation, high levels of stress, history of family violence, family or domestic violence, community factors, decreased value of children, minority, disabled, or based on gender, social acceptance of violence, media violence, organized violence, wars, high crime rates, all confer additional risk for psychological maltreatment. And what about the effects? Psychological maltreatment has a high probability of damaging children's physical, mental health, spiritual, moral, or social development. Can influence the child's sense of self, can lead to emotional instability and interpersonal difficulties and learning problems, and also to poor physical health. Dick mentioned, and I think Yoram showed you some slides of brains. These are PET scans. The brain on your left is a normal brain. The brain on the right is a Romanian orphan. A couple of weeks ago, I evaluated a 12-year-old girl who spent the first 28 months of her life in a Romanian orphanage with a ratio of 40-to-1, babies in cribs being cared for by one caregiver, changing the diapers every 8 hours, putting the feeding formula in the baby's mouths. Very briefly, the relationship of adverse childhood experiences, including psychological maltreatment, to chronic health or long-term health in adults has been studied. Dr. Krugman mentioned Felitti and Anda's work. Here's briefly what they found. These are the conditions that they studied. Child abuse in its different forms and neglect, growing up with domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness in the home, parental loss, or crime. And this is the model. The adverse childhood experiences lead to some social, emotional, or cognitive impairment that then causes the victims to adopt health risk behaviors that are really self-soothing, attempts to deal with the problems and the feelings that are a consequence of the adverse experiences. Those lead to early disease and disability and to early death. And so in the study of over 17,000 adults in the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system in San Diego, California, they found child maltreatment highly correlated with the high-risk behaviors and the mental and social problems that you see listed here, and ultimately with the diseases and injury conditions. Here, once again, are the prevalence of the different forms of abuse and other adverse childhood experiences in the sample, again, of approximately 17,000 adults. And in this study, if you had sexual abuse and physical abuse in your childhood, you'd have an A score of 2. They did not try to separate for severity or number of occurrences. So it's just the different forms adds numbers. So you see here that at 0 adverse childhood experiences, the risk of adult alcoholism in that sample was a little over 2%. With 4 adverse childhood experiences, it was 16%. You can see these are very large effects. Intravenous drug use from under 0.5% to nearly 3.5%. I think that if you go out to like 5 or 6 ACEs, it's like a 50-fold increase, 50 times more risk. Suicide, only around 1% with no adverse childhood experiences, and pushing 20% with 4 or more. You can see this is a very serious problem with regard to long-term health problems. Again, supporting the issue that health, public health, need to come to the table and be that third leg of the stool. And these things translate into direct healthcare costs. There's a prospective arm of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study where they're studying the drug utilization of these individuals and looking at it compared to their childhood experiences. This just shows you a little bit about how expensive medication use is in the United States. And this shows you the amount of antidepressant prescriptions versus ACE score. So from around 30% up to nearly 100% with greater than 5 adverse childhood experiences. So the ACEs contribute to the long-term lifetime costs of prescription medications, especially psychotropics. There's a statistic called population attributable risk, and here you see the percentages of different conditions in women that are attributable to the adverse childhood experiences in this large sample. Over half of current depression, over half of suicide attempts, 2/3 of alcoholism, around half of drug abuse, nearly over 3/4 of IV drug use, half of promiscuity, nearly 2/3 of sexual assault, and half of domestic violence in terms of the correlation. So therefore, Dr. Felitti has said that adverse childhood experiences determine the likelihood of the 10 most common causes of death in the United States and have probably a substantial contributing input to the $2 trillion per year that we spend on health care. And those are the 10 top risk factors associated. So again, Dr. Felitti suggests that adverse childhood experiences are the most basic cause of health risk behaviors, morbidity, disability, mortality, and healthcare costs. So what can we do? Helping, as Dr. Krugman said, with regard to early childhood nurse home visiting, helping parents raise safe and healthy children is presently the only feasible approach for decreasing these harms and their associated health care costs. Now this case example from Utah. 11-year-old boy chained in his family's basement. They needed expert testimony because in Utah, the law requires proof that the acts cause severe developmental delay or severe impairment of the child's ability to function. That requires expert testimony. It seems nonsensical because you show what's done to a child, it seems common sense, this is really bad. Here's the home in which this child lived. Looks like a nice home. The boy reported that he runs away and so he gets handcuffed. This is the basement in which he was chained to a concrete block. His stepmother seemed to be rather indifferent. She wanted the handcuffs back after the investigation. The father admitted that he put socks around his ankle and it was hooked up to a cement block. He was asked if the boy ate with the family. No, he didn't. And the father explained that the last time they'd met with the Child Protective Services, they were told that they were going to remove him and that they would then charge the father for the care, the cost of taking care of the child in foster care. So that's when they decided to chain him up whenever they weren't home. And it was a neighbor who reported coming into the house and that the boy couldn't even sit at the table, this is the attribution of the stepmother actually, that when this boy, who had been the victim of physical and sexual abuse when living with his mother and her consorts. He first came to their home. He was very under-socialized. He was prescribed medication, but they stopped giving it to him. They chose to take him off. And ultimately, after the trial, both parents were found guilty and served brief terms in jail, sequentially, so that one of them was still home to take care of their other children. And now I'd like to show you some segments from this incredible documentary, and it's 90 minutes in length. It's no longer available in terms of the way I got a copy of it. I purchased it. So I have a copy with me, which I'll loan to Dr. Ben Yehuda and the Harub Institute. It's my copy. So we'll go to that. This is a pretty amazing situation in which a family allowed these television producers to put cameras in their home. So you're about to witness psychological maltreatment. We have the volume up.
The place is Hamilton, Ontario, but it could be any place. The boy's name is Evan, but we've all known someone a lot like him. When he was 4, Evan was classified as conduct disordered, a holy terror for his teachers and his parents.
Dear Karen, just a short note to let you know that Evan did not receive a stamp today as he had some difficulties this morning. Evan portrayed quite an aggressive behavior at our snack table and eventually had to be removed. I allowed Evan to go outside. Evan gouged his fingernails into the back of a young boy, leaving a long mark in his skin. There was no apparent reason for Evan's actions. Evan grabbed a classmate by the neck in a headlock and left fingernail marks embedded in the back of the boy's neck. Evan is a very confused, unhappy boy who does not appear to be in control of his behavior at this time. We are hoping that you will be able to set up an interview time next week to discuss Evan's behavior. We are having some difficulty with Evan following directions and the interactions with his classmates.
He is 11, in grade 6, has above-average intelligence and above-average talent for getting into mischief. Foreshadowings of serious problems.
He's shoplifted. I'd maybe say for 3 years we've been aware of it. The latest incident has been Evan has started smoking, and that was brought to our attention by his school. He was suspended the last day of school before Christmas. He was caught smoking on the playground at school. So you can get right in there. Just the wallpaper.
A camera in the den caught this scene. For the second time in less than a month, Evan has been suspended from school. Because both parents have jobs, they now have a childcare problem, and all because of a senseless practical joke during art class. Evan tries to explain why he sabotaged a teacher's coffee cup.
In the teacher's coffee mug, I put paint.
In art class, while the teacher was out or turned her back or something, she had a cup of coffee there. He puts 2 or 3 different kinds of paint in her coffee, some clay, hoping that she would drink it as a joke. I'm just so upset. Oh.
You like doing this to your parents? Then how many other kids in school go around putting paint in a teacher's coffee cup?
Ask him. Start with the question. Ask him the same question you did. Except don't allow him to say the reason was, because there's no reason.
What would happen to you if you put paint in my coffee cup? Be a whole lot of shit flying around, wouldn't there?
Okay, now, what happens in the program is they alternate between an adolescent treatment program for substance abusing and behaviorally disordered delinquent adolescents, which we're about to go to, and the home that Evan lives in with his family.
For a time when
And because
I
these
took
are
a
minors,
popsicle
they're wearing the
after
masks
supper
to
without
protect their
asking him.
privacy.
I was downstairs in my room, and he come down there and he caught me eating it, and he beat me with a hockey stick just for taking a popsicle without asking.
It's impossible for me not to love her because she's my mom. I'll be honest with you, I'm still scared of her.
You know, you have a bad day, you go and kick your dog. Well, my dad would come home and beat me, smack me around for anything, you know. I'd have to do, like, just anything minor.
When I was about 9 years old, I had a calloused ass because my stepfather had a big fat leather belt and a calloused ass, and I just stood there and took it. I closed my mind off from everything. I calloused my mind.
2 are over 18, so don't need masks. Jennifer, a drug abuser, several attempts at suicide.
I was eating my cereals and she had cigarettes and I was playing with them, and she put tobacco in my cereals and I had to eat them.
Brad is older than the others, his life chaotic from alcoholism and drug addiction.
I always felt very small with them, and I always felt, I was always afraid. Fear was the big thing.
Very high percentage of people that were physically abused go on to physically abuse their own families. But one of the interesting statistics...
Their teacher, Ron Canar, found familiar themes in memories of childhood. The most common conflict with parents, often stepfathers.
Control you really have.
I don't know who my real father is. I wish I would have known who he was, and I wish he would have stuck around.
How many stepdads have you had since that approximately?
5 or 6.
5 or 6.
In the Portage group, there was a consistent sadness running through recollections of their parents.
It's weird because I love the guy. Really do. Stick up for him any day of the week when somebody's putting him down. Because he has done a lot for me. He always had a roof over my head, and I always had food in my stomach and a warm bed to sleep in. But the rest of it was never there.
The rest of what?
Just being a family of love and care. It's like he couldn't show it. It was not man enough. It wasn't being a man if you did that. And it rubs off. I always swore to my mother I'd never be like him. And I turned out even worse.
The stories of the Portage group revealed a clear link between childhood pain and the violence later on in life.
I've been drinking since I was roughly 11 years old, and drugs since I was 13. So you're looking, let's say, on the verge of 16, 17 years.
January 28th, Karen tells Mike someone has unplugged the freezer.
How come?
Evan becomes an immediate suspect.
Evan admitted that he might have unplugged it.
Get the fuck out away from me.
Oh, fuck
It's a
you.
common, a high correlation between
back up,
cruelty to
I don't need
animals,
this shit.
pets, and child abuse.
You don't need this shit. You know how much meat was in that freezer?
It's not all ruined. Luckily, only 5 or 6 packages thawed.
It's not one thing, it's a fucking other. What the fuck are you doing with that watch on? Get the fucking thing off. I have had it with you. Play your games with somebody else.
What game are you talking about now? I want you to call up Silvio and his brother and see if he...
Now what we're going to back to Portage, the treatment facility. You're seeing a reenactment from Brad and his interaction with his parents that he's reenacting as part of his treatment behind a screen, and then they juxtapose actual footage from Evan's home with that.
This is Brad's bad memory, an echo of the harsh reality in Evan's life.
Getting sick and fucking tired with your attitude. If you want to live underneath my roof and you want to have clothes in your back, you'll go by my goddamn rules.
So, like, when are you going to stop and learn to follow our rules, Evan?
I've had it up to here with you.
I'm telling you, I'm fed up with this shit.
I'm fed up with this bullshit.
You play your games, but don't expect us to give you sweet fuck all.
This is my house. I paid for everything in this place, and I paid for your fucking clothes.
And if you think I'm talking to the wall, I'm talking to you, beefhead. Larders?
Go pack your goddamn bags and get out of my face. I'd never want to see you around here again.
Your insubordination is going to get a hook upside the fucking head. Don't like it, the fucking door's there.
Broken bones heal. Bruises go away. Yeah. You might have scars, some stitches, but it's not that bad. It's the stuff inside that hurts the most. The mental and verbal abuse that you get, just for myself, is 3 times harder to accept and to deal with than the physical ever was.
I'll tell you, Evan, you'd have been me, you'd be dead. Because my father would have killed you.
What does it mean to a kid when some adult shouts, "I hate you"? I want to.
Rightly, we should have been.
Just fucking fed up with this shit. I'm gonna kill him soon. You're fucking living on borrowed time, bud, I'm telling you.
Mike has spent time in jail for assaulting Karen.
You better fucking dummy up and soon.
While on probation in 1990, he threatened me. Like, while that year probation was still intact, he took a knife and held it to my throat and threatened to slit my throat for not talking to him.
Karen eventually took the children and fled. After resettling, she left Kimberly and Evan with her sister and took a holiday in Mexico. While she was away, Mike went to court and accused her of desertion. The court handed the children over to him.
He got the interim order for custody, and when I came home and found that out, I say that I had a mental breakdown.
She went on to attempt suicide by running her van into a bridge abutment.
Objective in coming here is to stop him from coming here. To get maybe your point of views on how you viewed your parents, because he won't talk to us. Are you okay with that?
Yeah. I just had a question. What kind of ways are you dealing with his behavior?
In the past, he has been spanked. There was a lot of verbal abuse in the past. Real quick to jump on him, and it got to the point where he was on his bed for a month with nothing in his room, and it just got totally carried away to the point where this child had no feelings. He did not care what we did.
What are you doing? I'm just hanging around here, grounded. You know I'm grounded? I'm grounded because I got suspended from my school. I got suspended because
He's not allowed to use the television, the Nintendo, the Game Boy. Just, there's your bed. You want to do something to occupy your time? Here's a book.
But that's just
Ryan remembers when he was Evan's age, getting in the same kind of trouble, getting the same kind of punishment.
My consequence was I had to stay in my room for a week. No TV, no radio. All I had was a book. For a week. It screws you up. It's like being in a cell. But without the bars, it still has a psychological effect on you.
So far, you've seen spurning, terrorizing, and isolating.
I felt caged. felt really rejected and alone. I felt to rebel. You know, like I felt nobody cared for me. It didn't matter who I lived or died, but I had to rebel.
The rebellion occurs in many ways, but rebellion can cost money.
If you're not in this house by 9 o'clock, then you better find someplace to sleep, because you're not going to be allowed in the house. Supper time, you make your own supper. Breakfast, you make your own breakfast. Lunches, you make your own lunches if you wish to go to school. I am finished with you. I don't even want to know. Don't ask me to give you an allowance. Mommy is not going to give you allowance. I am not giving you an allowance.
You won't be included in anything?
You don't have to feed your dog anymore.
You don't have to do
There are 3 people in this family as far as I'm concerned. Me, Mommy, and Kimberly. That's it with you.
You've made it very clear that you don't want to be part of it. So.
You don't want to go live someplace else? Go live someplace else. Please and thank you. We do not want to live with your aggravation anymore. You have driven me and Mommy completely bananas. So I don't care whether you make yourself peanut butter or jam sandwiches or shit sandwiches. That supper is for me, Mom, and Kimberly. You're not my kid.
If and when you want to belong again, we will see a change in you. But as far as we're concerned, that's it.
Mommy is not going to end up in the hospital anymore. I love that woman too much. I'm not taking you camping. I'm not taking you golfing. When I plan our holidays this summer, you better find someplace to live for 3 weeks.
Because this house will be locked up.
You do what you want. Sayonara.
I'm back in head feeling like this. Guess we can put a chair behind now, eh?
I guess.
Three days later, Evan asked to be readmitted to the family. After negotiation, Mike and Karen consented. For a week there was harmony. Mike and Evan went fishing. But relations quickly deteriorated. And after the film was shown in Canada, both Evan and Kimberly were removed from the home by the Children's Aid Society. They are now in foster care. The social agencies say all the family members will receive help and eventually will be reunited.
I like plumbing. I want to be a plumber. It's my goal.
This is a very troubling documentary, but it's something that happens and that we very seldom see. Those of us that work in mental health hear about some of this from the patients that we try to help. Thank goodness that human beings are quite resilient and that we now have treatments that have scientific proof of their efficacy. Since Dr. Krugman started working in this field a little bit before I did, we've come a long way. One way to illustrate this is through the amount of science that is now being brought to bear on this problem. This is Child Abuse and Neglect, which Dr. Krugman edited, I think, for the longest tenure of any of its editors. Now published 6 times a year? Monthly. I should know that. One issue, the August issue. 3 articles relevant to this topic. The impact of exposure to domestic violence on children and young people, a review of the literature, an 11-year review, 1995 to 2006, over 1,000 articles that they then selected from. And what they found is that the evidence of harm, but also the evidence of resilience, and that you have to look at a case-by-case basis. Self-reported disciplinary practices among women in the child welfare system, association with domestic violence victimization. They looked at a nationally representative sample of over 3,000 female caregivers, and 443 had experienced domestic violence within the last 12 months, 1,161 had experienced domestic violence more than 12 months previously. Both groups reported more use of psychological aggression in the disciplining of their children. However, only those with domestic violence within the last year reported more physical aggression and neglectful disciplinary behavior toward the children. Another article, Psychological Abuse Between Parents, Associations with Child Maltreatment from Population-Based Sample. These researchers looked at 1,149 adults in South Carolina, I believe, sample of women with, this is self-reported potentially neglectful or physically aggressive behavior with their children. And if both mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, participated in verbal abuse of the other, there was a 15-fold increased risk of abuse of the children. If only the father verbally abused the mother, there was over a 5-fold increased risk. We now have science. We need, as you are developing here in Israel, centers that specialize in the assessment and the treatment of child abuse. Health needs to come on board, and public health. Governments need to recognize how significant a problem is the plague of child abuse and neglect, and how it warrants far more resources than it has so far received. And we need to find ways to pay those professionals in health, like Dr. Ben Yehuda, who are doing this kind of work for the work, and also the psychologists, the social workers, the child psychiatrists. There's simply too much work out there and too much information to view this as a sideline that they do on top of all their other jobs that they get paid for, because those are important work as opposed to this, which should be charity. And finally, we'll end with the words of Erik Erikson, the great developmental psychologist, writing again in the Journal of the American Medical Association a few years after the battered child syndrome appeared. Someday, maybe, there will exist a well-informed, well-considered, and yet fervent public conviction that the most deadly of all possible sins is the mutilation of a child's spirit. For such mutilation undercuts the life principle of trust, without which every human act, may it feel ever so good and seem ever so right, is prone to perversion by destructive forms of conscientiousness. Thank you very much.